Namaste and welcome everyone to Atharva Forum. We'll be discussing this book, The White Sahibs in India. Now, before I go too deep into the topic, I'd request you all to please subscribe to Atharva Forum if you haven't done already. Now, this book, White Sahibs in India, was first published in 1937, so pretty much about 90, close to 90 years ago. And then there was a reprint last year in 2022 by an organization called Sidh in Missouri. This book, White Sahibs in India, was written by a person called Reginald Reynolds, an Englishman, and it was written in that era when the Britishers really hadn't left India yet, and we still hadn't gotten our independence. So the context of this book is pretty much in the 1930s, 1920s, and that kind of an era. And a lot of the details and references in this book are really all about what was the exact impact of White Sahibs coming into India, essentially the whole process of colonialization, East India Company, and how the company interacted with Indian people at large, and various facets of that whole interaction, primarily in terms of how it impacted our economy, our polity, our culture, our life in general, education, and all of that. Now, interestingly, this book has a foreword by Nehru. So in case there is somebody thinking that this sort of a discourse is more let's say Hindu right wing and all of that, it is nothing like that. Like, this book was written primarily in an era that predates a lot of our current day political discourse. So it's very interesting that the foreword of this book was written by somebody like Nehru, whom we don't usually associate with this sort of a discourse. My own reflection on this book is also driven by this fact that while these days, at least in the past few years, there has been a sort of an increased awareness on topics like these. And let's say if you take the name of somebody like Dharampalji, he's much more popular now than, let's say, he was a decade ago. So in general, there's been this whole awareness that has been built out over the years, where people are now trying to understand more and more of how India was before colonization. And a lot of this is also coming from some of the uptick in these topics like decolonization. So in that context, what I found interesting about this book is that it is a very fascinating sort of an overview from the eyes of somebody who was close to how the company was working, how colonialization was kind of shaping up in the country. But then he was not an Indian, nor was he somebody who was directly benefiting from anything that was happening as a part of the colonial processes. So just to quote on this book, there is also this, it goes like this. So this book tells the story of English officialdom in India, not from the government point of view, nor from the Indian, but from the point of view of an incorruptibly just and honest man, and one who is thoroughly humane. And Perles Buck says, Reginald Reynolds has written a bold, brave book, and one hopes he'll not suffer for it. Now, the reason why that statement is really being made is that the analysis in this book is very incisive, and it is very brutally honest. So let's say you are somebody on the other side of the aisle, which is essentially if you are somebody associated with the company or with the European authorities or with the English polity at large, you won't let this book really be read, because the kind of honest, frank assessment that is being done of the rule of the White Sahibs, it'll really pinch on both sides. So if an Indian is reading it, it's quite an emotional journey to read through the book. And if an Englishman also reads it, it is not an easy read for them either. So that's the reason why I think this book needs to be read more in our times today. Although, let's say, it was written in like 80-90 years ago, as I said at the start of this particular talk. And again, interestingly, if you try to look up on this book on, let's say, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, all of that, barely any mentions. There are just a few mentions here and there. Some of them are, of course, related to the reprint that was done in 2022 by Sidh. But otherwise, there are barely any mentions. And that's also one of the reasons why I think this book really needs a lot more attention in our times today. Now, let me start with a small snippet from this book on the impact of railways in India. So typically, the flow of this book is really about taking every single part of how colonialization or colonization impacted India, and then dissect it onto how did that process start, what is the impact of that process, so on. So in the case of railways, of course, we know this whole story that is told to us today, that the Britishers may have been bad, colonization may have been bad, but railways is good. Railways is the gift that they have given to us. Without them, where would we have been? And railways has connected all of us and uplifted our infrastructure and all of that. Now, interestingly, in this book, railways is also analyzed also from a finance or like an economic sort of a perspective. And that is where the author Reginald Reynolds actually says that railways was actually a form of economic imperialism, because he looks at it in the sense of what was the capital expenditure that went into building railways, who bore the losses or who bore the expenses, and who benefited with the profits, and who are the shareholders, and who got the dividends and all of that. So this is typically not a perspective that we look at railways. We just look at the end benefit and then think of it as, okay, it was perhaps a good initiative. Now here is where the author says that there were a lot of guaranteed companies. These are more like bodies. You can think of them as the equivalents of East India Company as we know it today. That there were a lot of these guaranteed companies that partnered in building Indian railways. And here the author says that the nature of the contracts by which these guaranteed companies built Indian railways, he says it is probably unique in the history of financial operations. So to build railways, you need a lot of resources, right? So if you take the question of land, the government used to donate the land for free. So it obviates the whole difficulty of acquiring like a principal resource. So the government used to really give the land for free, because the government that was giving the land also is not our own. It is essentially a colonial government sitting on top of a huge land mass, and it used to donate this land for free to these guaranteed companies. And these companies, they started building railways, and if and when the railways showed a profit, that profit was the property of the company. And when there was a loss, the company's dividends would be paid from the Indian taxes. The Indian taxes, of course, was from the Indian masses. So essentially, this is where the author says that it is a unique contract that was entered into in terms of a history of financial operations, where whoever took the honors of building this project, they were benefiting with the profits, but the losses were socialized to the Indian masses. And this is where he says that the people of India were actually the sleeping partners in this astonishing arrangement. And they were compelled to balance the shareholders' losses and to produce, in addition, substantial dividends for these guaranteed companies out of their taxes. So he says, we as people of India at that time, we were all sleeping partners in these astonishing arrangements. So this is a very unique perspective that one gets to hear on railways, where usually as a commonplace knowledge, we really don't look into what was the capital expenditure of railways, what were the profits, what was the shareholder arrangement, and all of that. So there's a lot of detail in this book in that particular aspect. Continuing on railways, the author also refers to some of the discussions in the parliamentary committee in that era, let's say in the 20s and 30s. He says this, that Lord Lawrence in the parliamentary committee, he makes this remark where he says that the railways have been extravagantly made. They have costed a great deal more than they are worth or ought to have cost. So essentially, they are trying to look at the cost incurred for railways, and they are passing this remark in the parliamentary committee of England of that era. And the author hence says that the loss on Indian railways is incalculable. And we today, when we look at railways, we look at it as a gift, but we don't get into this understanding of what was the cost, was it really worth as much, and what was the inner workings in terms of who bore these costs. And this is a perspective that this book clearly provides to us. Now, similarly, there's a talk of railways, and there is also a mention of shipbuilding in the early parts of the book. Again, shipbuilding is something which some people are aware of in some pockets in terms of the native Indian prowess on shipbuilding. And even here, Reginald Reynolds brings a perspective which is kind of not commonplace in our own understanding of our own past today. The author here, he refers to a letter which was written in 1670, early parts of when this whole colonization process entered India. So this is a letter that was written by the company's factor at Balasore to the Court of Directors in London. and this is written in 1670. And there, in this letter, the company's factor actually makes this remark. Here is the best and well-grown timber in sufficient plenty, the best iron upon the coast. Any sort of ironwork is here ingeniously performed by the natives as pikes, bolts, anchors, and the like. So essentially here, this is somebody from the company actually saying that the kind of shipbuilding activity that happens in this part of India is top-notch. So he says there is best and well-grown timber here, and the best ironwork also happens here. Very expert master builders, there are several here. They build very well and launch with as much discretion as I have seen in any part of the world. They have an excellent way of making shrouds, stays, and any other rigging for the ships. In 1670, this is somebody crediting the prowess of shipbuilding of India. This letter above was also quoted in a book called History of Indian Shipping by Mukherjee, and this is something that the author again cites as a reference. So in Mukherjee's book, there is another reference where it says that the British actually borrowed plans and designs from the Indian shipbuilders. Now today, if you talk about something like this, you are immediately met with a sense of doubt, or somebody might ask you if you are from the Sangh or if you are from the right wing, or if you are reading something from WhatsApp University and all of these things. Because in general, this whole sense of inferiority has been ingrained so much in our own minds that to even think that we were very good at shipbuilding in the 17th century, and where Britishers used to actually take plans and designs from Indian builders, it is something that a lot of people find hard to digest, because we have been told that we were bad, we were poor, we didn't innovate, we were not builders, we were not engineers, and all of this. So again, here the author talks about some of the repercussions of policy on shipbuilding. So he cites this particular instance where these ships that were built in India, when they arrived in the port of London, when people saw these Indian-built ships, there was a lot of sensation amongst the monopolists there in England or Europe. And these shipbuilders of the port of London, they took the lead in raising the cry of alarm on Indian-built ships. So essentially, shipbuilders in London, they panicked looking at the quality of ships that got built here and traveled all the way to the coast in London. And the government there, an obliging government of England, they saw to it that the Indian industry perished. So that is where there is a clear reference that is being made, that it is not just the quality of our ships was good, it was also that it was so good that the shipbuilders in London used to feel threatened, and they worked with the government of that era through the colonial policies to make sure that the Indian industry perished. Again, this is not a perspective that is commonplace today in a lot of our own minds. We don't carry this sort of a sense of pride of our own engineering abilities in our past. Neither are we aware of how it got systemically destroyed by policy interventions. Usually we have this tendency to think, okay, perhaps maybe we were good, but we were not great. Our whatever we manufactured, they were perhaps inferior, which is why we didn't make the cut, and superior goods sort of took over. But that is where in this book, Reginald Reynolds continues to emphasize a lot to throw some light onto how government policy, a colonial government policy, also played a very significant role in destroying Indian industry, and how industrialists in England and London of that era, how they had their vested interests in seeing this industry to be destroyed. Now, apart from railways and shipbuilding, there is also a lot of elaborate discussion on weaving. Now, the story of weaving in bits and pieces is something a lot of us know in our heads, because that is a very popular picture we have of independence movement. We have this idea of Swadeshi, and of course there is Gandhi, Charkha, and then the hand spinning sort of a model. But then there's a bit more detail in this book in terms of the actual impact of pricing, actual impact of policy, import duties. And here the author talks about a writing in 1772 by an English merchant named William Bolts, who described the condition of Indian weavers as that of slaves. The weavers were flogged if they refused to sign contracts which fixed the prices 40% below market rates. So essentially, people were forced to sign contracts where they had to lose more money than they would be making otherwise had they been on their own. Another industry, so to say, is irrigation. So here the author talks about this whole illusion that the colonizer has, that they are the ones who have brought, let's say, progress and development to the colonized lands. So here the author says, he gives a lot of elaborate references to all his citations on irrigation in this part of the book. The author says that the British still believe that they brought irrigation to India. The simple fact, proved by Sir William Wilcox, is that canals built 3000 years ago by the rulers of Bengal have fallen into disuse and disrepair under British rule. What was achieved 1000 years before Christ, the British government, with all the devices of modern engineering at its disposal, they had not even the interest to maintain. So here, the picture that is being brought out is that there was a well-functioning system of irrigation. You had a lot of canals, and some of these canals were built and running for 3000 years. And these were the canals that fell into disuse and disrepair under British rule. And the British government, for a long period of time, they didn't show any interest in reviving irrigation, even though they had modern engineering methods at their disposal. Now, it is only at a later point in time that the British started showing more and more interest in irrigation. Up until then, railways was the more lucrative project for them in terms of the finances, or in terms of how much money can be made out of it. It is only after enough money came out of railways when the focus started shifting into other areas like irrigation. And that's where, again, Reginald Reynolds says that the control of canal water was a powerful political weapon with which to menace seditious peasants. We look at the whole thing around irrigation also the same way how we looked at railways, which is that we didn't have anything, and it was only because the Britishers came that we got all of this irrigation. Again, here the author is trying to put some light in terms of the political context of this particular phenomenon, of how the British interest in developing irrigation also has its own political implications. And he speaks of how the control of canal water was a powerful political weapon. That the East India Company in its early years, they neither repaired the canals nor permitted the people to do so. And he refers to the work by Dutt in terms of the economic history of British India. And there he says that the greater part of the 19th century, the canals, which were the arteries of Indian agriculture, they were continually neglected in favor of railway construction, because the latter suited the economic interests of Britain at that time. So this is again where the author is trying to emphasize that you need to study the whole chain of events as to why irrigation was neglected at the start and railway construction was preferred, and then later slowly the attention sort of shifted. And eventually, when the irrigation works were actually seriously undertaken by the British government, the peasant gained nothing from the profit that was shared by the government, the banks, the British contractors, and their employees. Again, here the perspective is very similar to what the author tried to draw with respect to railways or with respect to shipbuilding. We look at irrigation, but we don't look at who was building those works and what was the whole financial arrangement. And that is where the author tries to draw attention to the fact that these irrigation works that were being done, there are multiple parties involved. There is the government, there are banks that are financing these efforts, there are a lot of British contractors, and then their own employees. So if you start looking at each one of the initiatives taken up by the British government in that era, it will be very evident that they were doing it for their own profit, and there was nothing great in terms of the service that they were offering here, because a lot of it was extractivist, and in the end it was essentially used as a means to control the Indian masses, in this case peasants. So here he makes a very interesting point, that he says that imperialism has brought no benefit to India which a free country could not have developed for itself. And he gives an example of, you may get foreign technical assistance as Russia has employed in the 30s and in that sort of the Soviet era, for example. He here gives a reference to a greatest pioneer of irrigation, which is Arthur Cotton. So the place where I come from, in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana regions, Arthur Cotton is sort of a hero figure, particularly in the coastal Andhra and the whole Godavari Krishna basin in the Andhra Pradesh. So there, Arthur Cotton is idolized a lot for bringing irrigation to that part of the geography. So here, Reginald Reynolds actually says that he gives a citation from another book, and he says this, that Arthur Cotton is merely an imitator on a grand scale and with considerable personal genius of the ancient native Indian engineers. So he says whatever Arthur Cotton has done is essentially like a grand scale imitation of the prowess that was already there with native Indian engineers. And here again, a lot of this might seem like, oh, are you trying to say everything was good and great, sort of a thing? Because that again comes from our own inferiority, because we cannot digest this fact that ancient native Indian engineers actually had a prowess in irrigation. And that is where again the author substantiates a lot of this with many more references. I'll just quote one of them here. So he talks about a discussion in the parliamentary committee in England in 1873, where Charles Trevelyan, he makes this remark where he says that nothing can be better than the irrigation works of southern India. And this is something that anybody who is familiar with the works of Dharampalji, they won't find it very surprising, because Dharampalji himself also has done a lot of work in terms of crop productivity and agriculture patterns, food growth patterns, and all of that in South India. So again, here on irrigation, the author is trying to emphasize that there was something called a native Indian engineering prowess, and he gives a reference where he says Charles Trevelyan has actually put this quote out in the parliamentary committee, where he said that nothing can be better than the irrigation works of southern India. So up until 19th century, this remark was made in 1873. Even up until then, we had our engineering prowess with ourselves. And here, just to give like a larger picture in terms of the machinations of how colonialism in general operated, Reginald Reynolds actually cites this line from Lord Brentford. So Brentford says, we did not conquer India for the benefit of the Indians. I know that is said at missionary meetings that we have conquered India to raise the level of Indians. That is cant. We conquered India as an outlet for the goods of Great Britain, and we conquered India by the sword, and by the sword we shall hold it. So essentially, this is Brentford saying that we didn't conquer India for the benefit of Indians, and whatever we have done is for our own benefit, for the to have India as an outlet for the goods of Great Britain, and we conquered India by the sword, and the sword we shall hold it. And here Brentford again substantiates that I am interested in the missionary work in India, and I have done so much work of that kind, but I am not such a hypocrite as to say that we hold India for the Indians. We hold it as the finest outlet for the British goods in general and for Lancashire goods in particular. So again, it's somebody in that era stating clearly that we didn't conquer India for the benefit of the Indians. While today, that is all that we are told, that maybe there was some negatives or something bad with the British experience, but end of the day, it's a net positive. It has been for the benefit of us all. So let us embrace that part of the past. And that is what is being contested here in that era itself, where there were people, Englishmen, Europeans, who were in fact contesting this whole narrative, even in that era, to say that whatever has happened, that whole conquering aspect of it is essentially as an outlet for the goods of Great Britain and nothing to do with India or Indians in general. And this is where the author also quotes this line to say that the British manufacturer, he employed the arm of political injustice to keep down and ultimately strangle a competitor with whom he could not have contended on equal terms. So essentially, Reginald Reynolds is trying to contrast what the British manufacturer did and contrast it with the status or the state of Indian manufacturing in that era. So he says that they used political machinations. So the arm of political injustice was used to keep down and ultimately strangle the competitor, which is the Indian manufacturer, with whom the British manufacturer could not have contended on equal terms. So again, this is a perspective or line that many of us find hard to digest today, to even imagine that the Indian manufacturer was actually a solid competitor to the British manufacturer, and in fact, on equal terms, he was probably a very strong contender to the British manufacturer. This is where Reginald Reynolds also gives this reference to somebody called Mr. Wilson on the import duties on Indian goods. It's a very important perspective, because in this, what Wilson says is that the cotton and silk goods of India up to this period could be sold for a profit in the British market at a price which is about 50 to 60% lower than what was fabricated in England. Hence, it became necessary to protect the British market and the British goods by putting very prohibitive import duties up to 70 to 80% on the value. This is a sort of positive prohibition from the English or British colonizer perspective, but it is negative obviously from the Indian side, because this sort of a huge high import or export duties, they are going to just upset the whole profit and loss equation from the Indian standpoint. And that is where Wilson says that had this not been the case, which means had this prohibitive duties not been the case, had not the prohibitory duties and decrees existed, the mills of Paisley and Manchester, they would have been stopped in their outset and could scarcely have been again set in motion even by the power of steam. Wilson emphasizes that these mills were created by the sacrifice of the Indian manufacturer. And he says that had India been independent, she would have retaliated and she would have imposed prohibitive duties upon British goods and would thus have preserved her own productive industry from annihilation. So here, again, it's a very honest assessment by an Englishman or a European, where he's saying that whatever happened then happened because of these prohibitory economic financial policies. Our industry was actually good and thriving, and our goods were either they were just as good as what was available in Europe or a few notches superior, and we were not poor on quality, and neither were were we uneconomical or it was not like a financially not feasible sort of a process that our goods could have been sold in British. It was indeed quite profitable. It is only because of these prohibitory duties that were imposed at that time to protect the British industry and annihilate the Indian industry. That is what resulted in this sort of an imbalance. So this is the perspective that Reginald Reynolds is trying to bring by drawing onto this quote by Wilson. So again, he also cites one more remark by Thomas Munro on, so Thomas Munro gives this reason against the extension of the sale of British manufactured goods in India. So this part is again very interesting, because it also talks about why Indian habits are also perhaps not so tuned for the sort of consumerism that they were trying to inculcate by pushing for more and more British goods. So here Reginald Reynolds quotes a line from Thomas Munro, where Thomas Munro gives a reason against the extension of the sale of British goods. So he says this, that the religious and civil habits of the natives will also act as a let's say preventive in terms of consuming all of these British goods. In addition to that, Thomas Munro also says there is this aspect of excellence of their own manufacturers. So again, here he's essentially trying to say that it is not that without these British goods you don't find substitutes in India. There are excellent manufacturing operations or manufacturing people who exist in India as well, and that the excellence of their goods itself is sufficient that they won't be enticed by the British goods. So again, this is a very important perspective, because it sort of instills this sense of pride in us in terms of our own manufacturing capability. So it is not that we lacked something that the British goods inundated. It is that our manufacturers were actually just as excellent, if not better. So another aspect of this whole model, where there is a lot of money flowing from India to Britain, and what happens with that money. So this is where the Reginald Reynolds also brings out this interesting aspect, where a part of this money, interestingly, like part of this money that was extracted by the government or the company, some of that was also used to build churches. So he says there was this header in the financial transactions called ecclesiastical charges. So these ecclesiastical charges were essentially used to extract money from India and take that to build churches. So here he says that a sum of 200,000 pounds per annum is still paid from the Indian revenues to finance the Christian church. And this perhaps in some ways is the most scandalous of all the impositions which could be placed upon a population of which the overwhelming majority is non-Christian. So essentially, you had this whole non-Christian population, which is us Hindus in India. And then, of course, there was also a reasonable percentage of Muslims in that time. Remember, this is talking about 30s, 20s, or even earlier. So it is the undivided India. So you can pretty much look at India of that era as largely, overwhelmingly non-Christian. And the money from this population, 200,000 pounds per annum in this particular instance that the author is referring to, that was used to build a Christian church. And then he counts this over a period of 35 years, accumulated cost. And he says this, that 7 million pounds have been contributed under this header of ecclesiastical charges during the past 35 years. And it is simply a tribute from the native people of India to the principal religious institution of their conquerors. So it is essentially Indian people funding about 7 million pounds so that the colonizer could build a church. And that religious institution, essentially, it is a representative of the conqueror's religion and not the religion of the colonized population. And so, like I said at the start of this particular talk, there are multiple aspects that are covered in this book. So we spoke of railways, we spoke of shipbuilding, weaving, irrigation, church building, and there is also a lot of elaborate treatment on aspects like how did judiciary change, how did that impact local self-governance of villages, how was the police system, and how was it earlier, and what changed with the introduction of the British. So some of these remarks are somewhat similar to what, let's say, somebody like Gandhiji remarked in his Hind Swaraj, again in that era. So here on judiciary, Reginald Reynolds quotes Sir Thomas, who said that it is evident that our present system, which is the present judicial system, is not only most expensive and vexatious, but it is totally inefficient compared to the local sort of dispute resolution mechanism that we had, where you had ground up panchayats and essentially community-driven mechanisms, and that is being contrasted with this top-down centralized model. And this is where Reginald Reynolds also quotes Sir Henry Cotton, so who, looking back upon this process that had uprooted the panchayat system, he declared that a costly and mechanical centralization has taken the place of the former system of local self-government and local arbitration. So it was not just the local self-government, it was also a local arbitration mechanism that unless everything at the local level fails, nobody really used to go up. But with this sort of a centralization that came with the judiciary system, most people were forced to adopt to this sort of a system where you had to incur a lot of cost for all of this arbitration process. It was also happening in an alien language, and it was also happening in an alien place. So there is a lot of elaborate treatment in the book in terms of how judiciary itself as a process changed a lot. And then another very important aspect of the book and dealt with in some detail is on the impact on education. Now, I've drawn some references to Dharampalji's work during the course of this talk. Of course, Dharampalji's books like Beautiful Tree and other such works, they are the sort of the go-to to understand the state of education per the British records. But then in this book, again, there is a bit more color and a bit more spice added to what transpired in that particular era. And Reginald Reynolds here again quotes some of these familiar names. So he cites some data by Max Miller, who, of course, he was a scholar with the indologist bent of mind. So he may have had his own failings. But in this particular context, the author is actually citing something useful and factual from Max Miller's discourse, where Reginald Reynolds cites Max Miller to say that Miller actually asserted that there were about 80,000 schools in Bengal, which is about 1 to every 400 of the population. So this is something familiar to people who have read somebody like Dharampalji, or even those who have followed Gandhi's discourse on education, for example. So the author also cites Ludlow, who wrote this book called History of British India, and where he says this very telling sort of a remark. So he makes this remark that in every Hindu village which has retained its old form, I am assured that the children generally are able to read, write, and cipher. But where we have swept away the village system, as in Bengal, the village school also disappeared. So Ludlow in History of British India, he's actually saying that every Hindu village which had retained its old form, which means it was untouched with colonialism, there was school and there were children who were able to read and write. And wherever the British intervened, like in Bengal, that is where the village school also disappeared. And this is where Reginald Reynolds makes this remark that this disposes effectively of the boast that we are beginning to give education to the people of India. Essentially, I mean, this is again something that's very popular in our discourse today, that it was British who gave us education. And in this part of the book, the author is actually contesting that with a lot of references and citations and his own sort of understanding to say this thing, that this whole idea of British giving education to the people of India is essentially a boast. And again, giving some more references, he gives this reference of Mr. Adams, who did, again, a very similar inquiry into the number of schools in Bengal. And he says this thing, that there was one school for every 400 person. And this was at least as high an average that which existed in Great Britain in that era. So this is again very similar to what Max Miller did. Made a statement that 1 in every 400 of the population, right? So Adams' remark is also in the same mold. In fact, there is some other research which would also say that the number of schools that we had per capita was actually higher than what was there in Britain in that era. But essentially, the whole idea is to dispel this myth that British brought education to us, and to say that this whole thing of that British have given us education is essentially a boast. So that is being called out by the author here with several citations. When we talk of education, we always imagine this whole thing of students going to school, reading, writing, essentially a print sort of a model where you are taught to read from book or write some script. And this is where Reginald Reynolds actually again quotes Max Miller, who made this remark that there is such a thing as social education and education outside of books. And this education is distinctly higher in India than in any part of the Christendom. So Miller is here talking about social education and education outside of books. And he says that this education is distinctly higher in India than in any part of the Christendom. Through recitations of ancient stories and legends, through religious songs and passion plays, through shows and pageants, through ceremonials and sacraments, through fairs and pilgrimages, the Hindu masses all over India receive a general culture and education which are in no way lower but positively higher than the general level of culture and education received through schools and newspapers, or even through ministrations of churches in Western Christian lands. So essentially here, what Miller is trying to say, you have, let's say, Purana Pravachana's happening, you have plays happening, you have folk like traveling historians or balladists who come, they sing songs, they perform plays, and through this, they are actually imparting education to you, which are touching your epics, touching your Puranas, touching the fundamental principles of Vedas, Upanishads, so on. So again, this is very interesting because a lot of these people who are actually conducting this, who are actually these traveling teachers, very few of them were really Brahmin castes. To talk more on that, I think I would also draw a reference to a lot of these current literature that exists today on Jati Puranas and things like that, where you have a lot of these traveling sort of people across various communities, across the geography. These were people who were doing this job that Mueller is referring to, of reciting ancient stories and legends, religious songs, plays, and all of that. And this education is what was uplifting the culture of India and he says that it is positively higher than the general level of culture of Western Christian lands. So essentially, again, like I said, although personally, I have a lot of misgivings with some of Max Miller's discourse on the let's say the motives of the missionary motives or proselytizing motives of some of his writings. But on this particular point, he's so right that education, there was also a world of education that was happening outside of books. And the author Reginald Reynolds, he says this thing, that it is important to note this opinion in view of the fact that the widespread illiteracy in modern India, which is one of the results of the British rule, that is actually frequently urged as the reason for the inevitable continuation of the system that produced this illiteracy. Essentially, the discourse goes like this, right? That India is illiterate. Because India is illiterate, you need more of British education. And here, Reginald Reynolds is actually saying that it is the system of British education that actually made India illiterate. Had it not been for this system, we not just that we had school education, we also had this whole world of education outside of books. And this is essentially the sort of point that even Gandhiji and Dharampalji, they all make. Also, when they talk about this whole thing on beautiful tree and the Indian model of education, it is essentially this point that the British rule or the British model of education is one of the biggest reasons of widespread illiteracy in modern India. Now, I'll touch upon this part of the book on the evolution of Anglo-Indian mythology and perhaps conclude, because this is again something that is of great contemporary relevance, because although this part of the book, let's say, was written in 1930s, as I mentioned at the early part of the talk, a lot of this act continues to happen now, even now in like present continuous tense, essentially. So here, Reginald Reynolds actually talks about this whole narrative battle that came into play in terms of how, so he uses this word called Anglo-India mythology, essentially of how we perceive about our own past and our own history. So here he talks about James Mill, and he says that James Mill began this fashion among subsequent British historians of attributing all Hindu habits or practices to something mean or despicable motive and dismissing Hindu culture with contempt. So Mill was probably the first English writer to popularize this idea that Hindus are by nature dishonest and untruthful. Now again, this is very familiar to a lot of people today who pay some attention to these narrative battles and knowledge politics, that this is typically the popular picture that is presented to us about Indian past and about Hinduism in particular, that and we are trained to dismiss Hindu culture with contempt. And this is the part of the book where the author Reginald Reynolds is trying to emphasize on how this whole thing was actually orchestrated, and it is not something natural that we are now dismissing Hindu culture with contempt. It was actually engineered to happen this way. And he gives a reference to a book that is it was quite popular in the independence era, which is Mayo's Mother India, and it's called as a textbook of anti-Indian propaganda. And in fact, in the freedom struggle era, Gandhi called it as a report of a drain inspector. And in the context of this book, what Reginald Reynolds is trying to say is also that whatever we saw in Mayo's Mother India, the whole anti-Indian propaganda, or what he calls as a pornography classic, because essentially it's trying to create this whole nauseating and contempt-filled impression about India. And he says that whatever technique that was used in that era for writing this book, that sort of evolved into a mechanism to spread any kind of propaganda. And today, if you look at how the whole narrative or the picture on India is built, one can really relate a lot to what Reginald Reynolds speaks about here in terms of that technique. So I'll just talk about this part of the book where there are about 5 aspects of this sort of a narrative politics that Reginald Reynolds talks about, on how this sort of a propaganda or an anti-Indian or a propaganda that sort of wants to build this contempt for Hindu culture in your mind, how that works. So he says that the first characteristic is that there are statements of facts and alleged quotations that are demonstrably false. So these quotations are used, but they are actually false. Facts are thrown, but they're actually false. So that's one trait. There's another trait that he says that some very particular exceptional sort of instances are taken and they are given an exaggerated significance by generalizations and often by deliberate suppression of other relevant facts. So again, this is very familiar to have narrative on Hinduism and India at large is constructed today, that a one stray incident is taken and that is generalized as this is how the entire culture behaves, or this is ingrained into the day-to-day practice of um, the culture. Hinduism is evil, eradicate Sanatan Dharma, and all of that. And he also, the author also talks about a third trait, that the criticism is made in a spirit of racial hatred. So today, a lot of Indians themselves do this sort of criticism because they are also ingrained with this sense of racial hatred, just that they are just hating their own race. There is a sort of self-hatred that is ingrained into a lot of these commentators. And this Anglo-Indian mythology, the author says, was constructed right from that era of, let's say, the 19th century and the early 20th century. And then Reginald Reynolds also says this, that if somebody were to conduct this sort of a drain inspection of America or any other country in Europe, he says that even that would reveal equally unpleasant material for what it may be worth. Again, if you start doing this sort of analysis on any of these other countries, it is quite possible that there are, I mean, no country is perfect. So you'll always find something bad that is happening there in those countries as well. And that is where the author is trying to say that if you think of Mayo's Mother India as a drain inspector's report, it is quite possible that you can also prepare this sort of a drain inspection analysis done in any other country in that era as well. And this is something that is quite true for today's times as well, that a lot of these commentators who keep pushing a sort of a negative agenda on India, they are typically mute when you bring their attention into similar or some sort of wrong that is happening in any of these other countries. They just go mute and they don't comment, and they in turn may accuse you of what about tree and all of that. But essentially, Reginald Reynolds is trying to say that this is a trait of the whole Anglo-Indian mythology that has been inherited from the colonial era. And lastly, he talks about how a lot of these things also are happening because the colonial government itself is to be blamed for a lot of these happenings in the society back then. But these commentators don't talk about that enough. They put the blame on the Hindu culture. They put it as if the culture itself is innately unjust or evil. They really don't analyze what exactly was the colonial government doing at that point in time. So these are like the five traits. So just to recap, so he talks about how facts and quotations which are false are selectively used. He talks about how particular instances are just given exaggerated significance and generalized. He talks about how criticism was made with the spirit of racial hatred, and how a similar drain inspection that is done in any other country would perhaps again throw out similar negatives. And then he also says how the colonial government also has its share of the blame. So these are the five traits. Pretty much most of it continues to this day in terms of how the narrative is constructed with respect to India and India's past to this day. So here he gives 2-3 examples of how this whole mythology functions. So he says this thing that there were questions posed to Monroe in 1813 on whether Hindu women were treated as slaves by their husbands. So Monroe responds to these questions on if Hindu women were not slaves to their husbands. And he says that they have as much influence in their families as I imagine the women have in this country, which means his own country. So he's trying to say that this is sort of trying to build that balance, that it is not like exclusively your culture in that particular era was patriarchal or was trying to treat women badly. Good or bad, it was pretty similar to how it was in all other parts of the world. Again, on child marriage, there is a lot of discussion in the book, because remember, it's being written in 1930s. So at that time, there was a lot of this whole reformist conversation happening in the country, just like how this question of women, there is a question of child marriage, there is a question of prostitution, of devadasis and all of this. So the author does talk about all of them in this book. So specifically in terms of child marriage, he makes some remarks in terms of how the way it was portrayed as consummation happening pre-puberty was not a reality, and how the age of maturity also varied country to country, and what was the age of marriage in those other countries in that era, and how did it compare with the age of marriage in India. And he also makes some remarks of how there was also this whole narrative built that the early marriage system was destroying the physique of the race. And he also gives a lot of citations to discussions in that era to talk about this particular aspect on the impact of the whole early marriage system on the physique of the race in that particular era. So again, this is a very balanced sort of a perspective built, that it is not something that was exclusively bad, or an occurrence that was exclusively happening only in our shores. It was something that was prevalent in several parts of the world in that era, and the author is essentially trying to draw a contrast with the whole sort of guilt complex that the discourse was built up in that era on these particular topics. So again, I'll just talk about prostitution as a area that the author talks about in this book, and then perhaps conclude. So Reginald Reynolds here says that prostitution in India is another frequent subject of propaganda intended to create race prejudice. So just like how child marriage and just like how this whole thing of patriarchy was used as a subject of propaganda to create race prejudice or hatred about your own self, he says that prostitution was also another frequent subject of propaganda. So he says that whatever was the situation, let's say before the colonial era, what the colonial era did specifically was that the desire for young, attractive women actually grew from the regimental bazaars, which is where the colonial army was stationed. And he quotes a Swiss professor, Edmund Prevet, who says that the only place where women were not safe in India was under the walls of the British barracks. A lot of this whole picture on prostitution emerged from how British army exploited young, attractive women in the bazaars in that era. So he also quotes Dr. Sunderland in his book India in Bondage, where Dr. Sunderland says this, that in my own travels in India, I found that all communities in or near which soldiers were stationed, particularly British soldiers, they regarded their presence as a danger to their women and always felt greatly relieved when the soldiers were ordered away. So it is only when the British army was close to the community places, that is when people actually felt threatened about their women, because the whole narrative around prostitution emerged from that sort of a craving that the army had for Indian women. Author is trying to lay emphasis to the fact that this whole race prejudice was actually created, and it was essentially propaganda at work, where the whole narrative around prostitution, the way it was built, he says that it was essentially a lot of cover-up operation for how prostitution sort of stemmed from the desire by the British armies that were stationed in the barracks. So he concludes this part of the book also by citing this particular line from Horace Wilson, who actually says this, that India had been populous and flourishing, the people thriving and happy for centuries prior to the introduction of the European agency. So here Wilson is essentially saying that we were populous, we were flourishing, we were thriving, we were happy, and all of this was before the introduction of the European agency. But again, the picture we are forced today by various mechanisms is that it was a dark era, we were backward, we were not prosperous, we were not flourishing, and all of that. And repeatedly throughout the book, the author Reginald Reynolds is actually trying to draw emphasis onto this fact that you are carrying like a wrong sense of your past, and he's trying to correct it through his own understanding of how colonialism worked by giving a lot of references and citations all along. Now, in terms of the colonial economics, there is just one part that I'd like to emphasize before I conclude. That so Reginald Reynolds here says that he kept wondering, why is it that the colonizers were so happy despite all of this plunder and despite all of this evil that they were perpetrating in the name of colonization. And he says that the answer perhaps lies in this fact that while the Indian peasant was living in 1/7 of the dole of an unemployed British worker, which means whatever dole the British worker who didn't have a job, whatever he was getting from his government, the Indian peasant who is actually doing the work, he was getting paid 1/7 of that. And huge fortunes are being made from that peasant's poverty or from India's poverty in general and from the exploitation of that industrial labor. So be it the plantations, be it railways, jute, coal, irrigation, and any of these industries, lot of this plunder was what was funding the British people, and that is why they were happy and proud because they were getting richer and richer. And he says that a lot of these dividends that were paid to investors also was essentially huge in the sense that he makes this remark that it has been computed that every fifth man in Great Britain in that era was dependent either directly or indirectly on Indian connection for his livelihood. So the old age pensions, unemployment relief, education grants, and state allowances, everything that was happening in Europe and Britain in that era, they were all dependent on Indian money. So this is the perspective that Reginald Reynolds tries to draw in this book by trying to put a lot of emphasis on how money came in and money went out and how this whole plunder affected India and benefited Britain. So this book, I think, is particularly important in that context because it is trying to give this well-rounded perspective in terms of what exactly was the impact of colonialism, and using this from the eyes of a British or an Englishman's lens, sort of impartial and objective, because he was not emotionally invested in that sense in the cause of Indian nationalism, because he was you can think of him more as an observer who was trying to understand what was happening. And in this book, as I said, apart from all these aspects that I covered, there is also a lot of talk about caste system, guilds, and the impact of guild system. Impact of industrialization on guild system. There is a talk of depressed classes. There is a talk of the Hindu-Muslim question, Gandhiji's impact, independence era history, 1857 war, state of police, and all of that. So the book is quite detailed on all of these aspects, but I didn't touch all of that because the idea of this talk is essentially to throw some light onto this particular book so that more and more people actually take the effort and read the entire book and benefit from this perspective. So I'll just conclude with a couple of lines from the book. One is where in the middle part of the book somewhere, the author gives a reference to this line where he says that the dependence of India, it became not simply political, but and not just simply commercial. It is also that the subservience that was ingrained into India, it was not just outward, but it was essentially inward and psychological. So dependence was not just simply political, it was also commercial. And this whole subservience was not just outward dependency, it was an inward and psychological dependency. So I'll conclude with this line from the preface by Pawan Kumar Gupta ji of SID, who is behind the reprint of this book in 2022. India has suffered for a long time, first under the Islamic domination and later under the British. During the Islamic period, we were terrorized. We learned to mind our own business in public life. A schism developed in our own world between the public and the private life. So we reduced our dharmic concerns to private life and we learned to behave in the public realm. Essentially because the king's religion and your religion started, they are just two different things now. So that is one impact from the Islamic conquest, that a schism developed in our world and we reduced our dharmic concerns to private life and we learned to behave in the public realm. And then under the colonial rule, a sense of shame, inhibition, and inferiority got added to our already festering wound. So we had a wound that happened because of the Islamic conquest, and that was a festering wound. And onto that, we now had all of this added because of the colonial rule, that we have a sense of shame, inhibition, and inferiority. So we started feeling guilty about our past, and our ways appeared inferior, backward, and uncivil. The educated among us, which is people like me and people mostly the ones who are listening to this call. So the educated among us, they tried to cope with the pain by imitating and trying to become like them, which is trying to become like the colonizer, and even in the manner of thought and behavior. So essentially, we started thinking and behaving like the colonizer. And in the process, we got alienated from our own roots and we started developing amnesia, which means essentially we started forgetting who we are. So much so that today our sense of past is missing and our self image is pitiable. Our categories of perceiving and thinking have changed, and we have unknowingly adopted Western categories. So, even the way we think, how we perceive, and how we understand, even that has changed. Very unknowingly, we adopt Western categories and, in fact, Western modes of thinking. So India has been wounded, and this transgenerational trauma, it has had a debilitating impact on us, turning us into a dysfunctional society. So the reason why we are a dysfunctional society is because we have not healed from this wound that got inflicted onto us by the first by the Islamic conquest and then by the colonial experience. So this civilizational wound can no longer be ignored. It needs to be acknowledged, addressed, and healed. So this wound that has happened to us, first, it can no longer be ignored. So I think thankfully in the past few years, there is a bit more awakening on this aspect. So the fact that this civilizational wound cannot be ignored and it needs to be acknowledged, which means first you have to acknowledge that this has happened and it needs to be addressed and healed. That's the that's how I'd like to conclude this particular snippet from the preface of the book by Pawan Gupta ji of Sith. And I think that is the note on which I'd like to end this talk as well, because the whole purpose of this talk really has been that we need to start paying more and more attention to this particular civilizational wound, and we should stop ignoring it, and we should acknowledge that and start working on the healing process. Thanks to Atharva Forum for giving me this opportunity. Please subscribe to Atharva Forum for a lot of good dharmic content like this, and do purchase the book. Thank you.